Hi, I'm Carissa Carter,
And I'm Scott Doorley.
and we're about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy, and I've got two great guests joining me today who are shaping the future of design and innovation. Essentially, they're assembling tomorrow. I'm talking about Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley. Their book is called Assembling Tomorrow, a guide for designing a thriving future. Scott is the creative director at the Stanford d.school, where he's been instrumental in creating everything from innovative workspaces to digital products. He's also the co-author of Make Space, How to Set the Stage for Creative Collaboration. And his work has been featured globally from museums to publications like the New York Times. And then there's Carissa Carter. And Carissa is the academic director and adjunct professor at the Stanford d.school. Carissa's expertise lies at the intersection of data and design, and her work spans emerging technologies and climate change solutions. She's also the author of The Secret Language of Maps: How to Tell Visual Stories with Data. Together, Scott and Carissa co-wrote this book, Assembling Tomorrow. It's a book that provides us with the tools to design better futures. We dive into decision-making, efficiency, the role of reason in all of this, why pausing is important, and so much more. So let's get into it right now. My conversation with Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley. Enjoy. Scott, Carissa,
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining me today. We just choreographed an intro, folks. Behind the scenes, you missed it. We assembled an intro, just like we are going to be going through the book, Assembling Tomorrow, a guide to designing a thriving future. Scott and Carissa, thanks so much for being here today.
Thrilled to be here, and I hope you share the assembly process of that intro with your listeners.
I will definitely be sharing how that worked out. I had to go back into theater background to kind of do it, and then we're like, why don't we just use technology to make it work? I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. This book, fix it in post, as they say. So this book, and I mentioned this to you right out of the gate, it's a beautiful book. First off, it's a well-designed, inviting book, not just title, but just the way that it's kind of presented. When I look at this book, it feels like it is the way that you would want a book that discusses assembling tomorrow to be kind of crafted like. It just feels like there's that there's a weight to it that is within the pages that I think the design kind of really lends itself to. And so my first question, I'll start with you, Carissa, is what led you to collaborating with Scott on this book, which is quite the venture?
So Scott and I have worked together for a long time now, over 10 years, and in our respective roles at the d.school at Stanford, I'm focused on academics. Scott's our creative director. We've collaborated on a lot of different projects that have pushed the limits of where design is, where higher ed is going. And, when it came time to think about this final book in a 12-book d.school series, we wanted to craft something that is really about where we think design is going. And part of the fun was merging our two perspectives. And, neither one of us knew the answer going into the project working together. So this was really a back and forth. What might it be? It was an exercise in figuring out what we wanted the book to be as we were writing it. And also wrestling with a future that was rapidly changing, especially technologically and climate relatedly as we were writing it. So having to update as we went. So it was a fun process that was also really hard to do.
And you essentially divided the book into two parts, the intangibles that made Runaway Design and the actionables to unmake Runaway Design. And it again, it's almost like, the first part of the movie, and then the second part is kind of like, okay, well, here's how we passed the climax, so to speak, and now it's time to kind of unmake stuff. First off, Scott, for those what is Runaway Design, and why are we trying to unmake Runaway Design in our goal to assemble tomorrow in a way that works for us?
Yeah, Runaway Design is how we think about what's happening right now. And you can look at it in whatever way you wanted. Just now, Carissa mentioned climate change and technology. All those things are speeding up and they're getting a little bit more tumultuous. And there's a certain feature of this moment that's creating that, or at least we think it is. And that's that the materials that we're building with, so this is like AI or even synthetic biology, which we call artificial evolution, they're very intertwined. They're very hard to see. They change after you create with them. AI goes on to make decisions algorithmically and to learn and change how it makes decisions. Synthetic biology, as an example, literally can evolve after we create with it. And all that technology is not only getting more potent, but the arrival of it seems to be speeding up. And that's kind of testing our psychology. It's testing our climate from the industrial era, is kind of reaching the limits of climate. And so you're seeing all these rippling impacts, but they're a little bit hard to trace. Like even if you look at AI, they know what they're building, but they don't know why it comes out with the answers it comes out with, right? And so there's these unknown things moving quickly, making weird changes. That's runaway design.
And one of the themes I noticed when I was going through the book is this, and even the title, Assembling Tomorrow, there's this desire for certainty in a world that is far from it. For those that are kind of looking at this book and just looking at tomorrow and going, oh man, there's just too many dynamic elements. Things are like, again, they're feeling like they're getting away from me. Carissa, what are some of the things that you see that will allow people, the reader in particular, to kind of, hold on to, aspirational, feelings about what the future may hold, as opposed to a world that frankly is throwing things at us that make us think to the contrary in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, Mike. The world feels like a very unsettling place to be. We feel it too. It's like we're not immune to it, and we teach people how to make things and bring them into this crazy world. And so I think it's that classroom perspective that Scott and I have working with students, that we're pretty versed in taking these big messy problems and creating short experiences, learning moments, allow you to see, we call it seeing the unseen, right? To notice the effects that are happening to you, where you're feeling them, where they're coming from. And then like, how do you do, small things to give you agency to build that future? And the whole back half of the book is about that agency, right? So there are techniques for laying into noticing and feeling awkward, right? Which may seem counterintuitive, right? But it's about noticing when things are out of place and what might that design opportunity be. And then there's a bunch of other ones too, we could get into as well.
Well, I also noticed that, when we go through part one, there's this idea of connection, of flow, of feelings, make believe, very emotional components. And those things are the most uncertain of all, especially when we're dealing with, like you talked about, Scott, you alluded to AI, the idea of we don't know how it gets to what it gets to. We know what we're looking for, but how it does that is there's a mystery element to that, to a degree. I keep thinking about, and one of the things that kept coming to mind as I was going through the book, and again, deep read, was this idea of, I couldn't help but think about the age of reason. The idea of where we need to almost get back into this balance of emotion and logic. And that was one of the things that I kind of felt it seemed like there was an effort to do so, is to say, like, we're going to, the first part is like very emotionally connected. Like, these are the things that, this is how you might feel about a certain situation. The idea of getting into flow. You talk about efficiency. But what do you think about the term reason when it comes to this idea of assembling tomorrow, as opposed to where we're really thinking more binary these days, either left, right, black, white, logic or emotion? To me, I keep thinking, man, can we just get back to an age of reason of some sort? And if so, how? I'd love to have you touch on that, because I think that with reason applied, it can help us assemble a tomorrow that is, the kind of tomorrow that we want.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that has changed a lot in social science, say in the last 20 or 30 years, is actually the role of emotion in reasoning. And I think you mentioned, like, it's not about one or the other, it's about balancing them out. I think really, if anything, it's about taking the emotion into account. Because you can hear this, I mean, we're on a podcast, right? A lot of podcasts, you hear people who are exercising what they think of as logic, which is, totally, this leads to that, this leads to that, if that, then that. And it is like, let's say, sound logic, but their motivation for sharing that particular logic comes from emotions.
Right.
And their motivation to highlight this or that comes from emotions. So I think really the issue is that we've kind of quarantined both of them, and we think of it, you're either being reasonable or you're being emotional. And the real story is that we're emotional creatures. Our emotions sort of determine our reason. In fact, there's a lot of research around the idea that reasoning is sometimes just post facto justifying the decision you made with your emotions.
Crap rationalization.
Exactly. I mean, there's an amazing, we didn't put it in the book, but there's this incredible study down at USC, this guy, Antonio Damasio. Do you know his work?
No, I don't.
He's fascinating. So he's been doing the role of emotion in reasoning over, decades. And he studied people who had brain injuries to their emotional centers. And they were able to act very normal, right? They would do normal things. They would go about their day. Nothing seemed that different. But when you put a decision in front of them, they had an extremely hard time making a decision. So they get to the cereal aisle in the grocery store and just be stuck for hours because they can't make a decision about what cereal to choose. And what he realized, and he did other studies that corroborated this, what he realized is that, the emotional center is just the key to decision making. And so I think if we can take that into account and not try to pretend it's not there, that's how we can actually get to sort of like a more realistic version of reasoning and thought.
To dovetail off that, there's a part in the book that, as a comedian or a lapsed comedian and fascinated with pioneers in that area, you talk about responsiveness and the idea of being respond versus react, which I touch on a lot in my book because in my work rather, because reactivity taps into emotion in a way that responsiveness doesn't necessarily do. I'd love for Carissa to touch on this to a degree, because it was Lucille Ball. This is in the book, or I'm on page 280 right now. Responsibility is just the ability to respond, which it's half right. We can get into some of that, but when it comes to assembling tomorrow, whether it's the one that we're all heading towards or the ones we want to actually shape the way that we want, what is the role of responsiveness in that versus being reactive and even being proactive? Because we hear a lot about that too. I got to be proactive in a world that really doesn't kind of give us the time and space to be as proactive as we might want to be.
Yeah, I think the part that goes with that section where we have the Lucille Ball quote about the ability to respond is a section that really talks about how no matter how great our intentions are, something always goes awry, right? And one thing I'll share, this is also in the book, is we do this thing with our interviews with our incoming master's students. So these are students that want to get an advanced degree in design, where they share the ones that have risen to the interview level. Okay, so these are the cream of the crop. They share a project that they're really proud of in the interview. And you ask them to talk about, like, oh, wow, if this really takes off and is fantastic, tell me about what that looks like in the world. And so they go on and on about what might be with this project of theirs. And it's wonderful. It's great. It's wonderful to see that. And then the follow-up question is, okay, so let's say that's happened. What have you broken along the way? What systems have you affected? Who's been displaced? So like when everything goes right, what will still go wrong?
Right.
And it's not because something was hacked and it was broken, right? It's because everything affects something else. And so that's what we mean by the ability to respond. It's like we all have the best of intentions. But even when we put our best work out there, there's bound to be an unintended consequence. So how are we taking responsibility for that even after our products, our services, our designs, are launched into the world? How do we take that through the future?
Well, and again, the idea of perfection, it comes from the chapter about aiming for imperfection. And, when it comes to productivity, there's this real slant towards quantity, right? Because it's fixed, it's measurable. We all can understand that we need to have these 12 things done by the end of the day. But if you were to say that and everyone had 12 different things on the list, what are we striving for? Is it 12 things, or is it, so it becomes the qualitative aspects really kind of take a hit. And when you talk about the efficiency aspect early on in the book, I couldn't help but think about, the idea of motion theory and all that stuff that was introduced back in the day, and how quality, productivity was productiveness before that. It was like a state of being productive as opposed to like the activity of producing. And do you think that we are, Scott, I'll shift to you for this one. Do you think that we are past the point of no return when it comes to the idea that productivity is more about like there's an imbalance between quantity and quality? And is there a way to have a balance between this, in Thomas Sterner's book, I think it's The Practicing Mind, the piano maker that makes like, a craft piano and only makes like 6 per month, as opposed to Yamaha, who's cranking out, hundreds of them, if not more. Is there a way to get back to some sort of balance between qualitative productivity and quantitative productivity, this productiveness I'm alluding to?
Those are all really excellent questions. I have kind of two things to talk about there. One is our student experience at Stanford. So I work with a lot of freshmen, and I was just talking to a junior last night who was talking to a freshman. The freshmen were on the quarter system. Quarter system's 10-week classes, so very quick. The freshman is taking 22 units, which is, the minimum is sort of like 12 to 16. And this is like very normal. Fall quarter, they come in, they want to take, everyone tells them not to, right? So anyone who's been through that experience, so all the upperclassmen are like, don't do that. It's not good. And then they do it. Now they're signing up right now for winter quarter. They're kind of figuring out what they're going to do winter quarter. 20 units is what they want to do, right? Which is still too many. But so it's a really interesting thing is like, you feel like the quantity, if I have the quantity, I'm getting more. Right? Which is what you're saying. Whereas everyone who has gone through it is saying the quality is more important. If you take 20, you're going to have quantity, but you're not going to have the quality of experience. And every single, literally every single person they're talking to is telling them this, because they're coming to me saying, well, everyone, my academic advisor is saying this, my, my RA is saying this, my friend who's a junior is saying this, my brother who's a senior is saying that, but I want to do it anyway. And so I think to some degree, there's just a lot of pressure to do that. And a lot of times we've gotten to where we are because we've taken on so much if you're, in a situation like that. On the other hand, when you go through these big technological cycles where things get devalued. So if you look at, like, say in the 1920s when, manufacturing is really humming, you get this arts and crafts movement at the same time. Right. Which is a bunch of people saying, and there's, and what are the buildings that stick around? Go down to LA. What are the houses that are still there? They're the arts and crafts houses because people love them. And the ones that were just, kind of quickly built out of the Sears catalog are gone. Right. So there's something about, like, if you're working more slowly, you're working on a grander time scale too. Right. The Stradivarius violin, people are keeping that, blocked away. They're taking care of it. They sell it for millions of dollars, so there's a thing of quality takes time, but when you're in that, you're in quality time, and it's just a different state of mind. So I think we are getting sucked into it yet again, but I do think there'll be a backlash, just as there was, there'll be a backlash with just total AI generated content, right? Everyone's going to want something different.
It's going to be, I've talked to people about, it's going to be like the blogosphere when everyone started just to hire, anyone to write, and you'd have blog farms back in the day where it was just like, you remember, and now AI can just do that instead. Right. And so there's this diligence that you kind of have to keep in mind, especially if you're a content creator. But it as we're kind of going through this, I couldn't help but talk about harmony, because I know that you guys touch on that at the tail end of the book. And, we hear about work-life integration. We hear about work-life balance, which balance is the common term, which is why I put it out there. But I've used harmony a lot because I think harmony in design terms, and you know this way better than I do, but too much can be, it's like, especially in music or art, if it's too busy, then it's not harmonious, right? But so you have to kind of decide when to stop, like okay, this is and it's not static. So Carissa, when you think about harmony and this idea of seeking harmony, what role do you think that will play in the tomorrow that we'd like to see? And how do you get somebody to lean into that as opposed to these more, again, rigid terms of like, work-life integration or integrated as opposed to harmonious design, like things of that nature? Because there's a coldness to some terms compared to harmony, which definitely has a warmth to it.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there too. I love the term harmony because it also brings up discord, right? And in some ways in our book, we are talking about laying into disorientation and discord and things that like really do throw you out of whack as a way to regain that harmony. Um, I think practically in life, to pull that to the work-life balance model, and we were just talking about speed and productivity, right, which is highly tied with efficiency and this desire to, it's the taking all the units, but it's also the fact that I feel like that maintaining all those units and like maintaining that rate of work, like quote unquote, is the thing that is actually efficient, and like that's just flat wrong, right? We're obsessed with that efficiency in the US, and like that's why we get the dings on these devices that we carry around at all hours of the day. And I feel like that's the main thing that has really caused the disharmony in the work-life balance, is the fact that the technologies that we have built have allowed them to access us at any moment of the day.
Right.
I remember this was like 2016, 2017. So a fair chunk of years ago. A designer that Scott and I know, who used to teach at the D.school, this guy, Dave Bagarower, he stood up as a way to talk about a class that he was about to teach. And Scott, you may have even been co-teaching this class with him. And he goes, "Hey, everybody," this is like 2016, remember? And he's like, "How many of you sleep with your phones?" And at that time, it like merited like sort of a half chuckle, because a good portion of the people in the room like thought that was ridiculous. And other people like saw how like, oh wow, that's like eerie. Like if I don't sleep with it, it's next to me. And like that's what really fascinating. Only like less than 10 years ago. And now like I'll admit, but it's embarrassing that I've plenty of times wake up with my phone in my bed. Right. And I don't think anything of it. And it's because maybe I was looking at it beforehand. Maybe I couldn't sleep and I put something on to listen to. Like, it's just like also in the bed, which just means it's just wild that our tech has this access to us 24/7.
Yeah.
Like, we can't stop talking about how weird that is. That is not okay.
No, but in terms of design, it's done exactly what they intended it to do.
Exactly. Right? Like, that's it. That's the unintended consequence right there. Right. Like, They aimed for you to not want to put that down, and it's true, and it worked.
So Carissa, sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
Carissa just said something that I just want to I don't think we've said it this way, and I just wanted to flag it because in a sense, it's what the book is all about. And she said, we can't stop talking about how weird this is. And I think that's kind of the point. There are weird things happening. Things are changing a lot. We're naturally good as like an evolutionary tactic at getting comfortable with weird things. And that's an advantage mostly. But I think in a time of transition like this, which I think it is, it's really important to keep reminding yourself, wait, this is weird now that I have this phone in my bed and I never did before. This is weird now, that I'm just naturally interacting with an AI the way I would a coworker. And just to notice that, so you can see or you can make a decision about how you want to use it. I think that's the thing. It's like we're just kind of accepting it and adapting to it, but we should be sort of intentionally saying like, well, okay, this is going to be our lives. What do we want it to really do? How do we want to interact with this? And we have a lot of agency there.
Yeah.
You know, like having your phone in your room or not, you know, turning on your, you know, stopping the notifications or not, you know, having certain limits around how much you use, you know, how you use AI or don't in your collaborations, whatever it might be. We should just be like conscious about making these decisions. And the first step is like, wait, something weird is going on.
Well, and that involves pausing. That involves stopping.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is tricky because, you know, stopping for a moment, it's interesting. I've found, I'd love to hear both your thoughts on this. I'll start with you, Scott, is I've found that when I've stopped, there's a certain amount that I'm comfortable with before I feel like I have to get going again. I'm not alone in this too. Like I actually will do a presentation where I'll say, we're not going to do anything for 60 seconds, put your laptops down, close everything. And after the fact, I ask people, you know, how'd that feel? And a lot of it's like boring, anxiety, like not, some people are like calming, you know, so on and so forth. And then I find out who meditates, and the meditators are also, that didn't feel like a minute, that felt shorter. I'm like, well, you're right. It was only 42 seconds, but we're not good at telling that, like, I don't have a minute. A minute is a long time if you're not doing anything. A minute passes by like nothing. If it's, you know, again, we get into this idea of flow, right? But flow about what, right? I mean, people who are saying, I mean, you're saying, Carissa, the efficiency aspect. But what is efficient? Efficient isn't just doing stuff. It's about doing the right things. So and so we get, again, that stop to go, wait a minute, hold on. This is weird. Or hold on, is this efficient? Like number one, we don't take the time to stop nearly as long as we want to because it gets awkward, which you touch on, right? Be awkward. But also there's this fear of, what am I going to miss? I'm going to fall behind, you know, what does that mean? Because what are your expectations versus, so again, a lot of this stuff comes back to the emotional component. So Scott, like when it comes to the pause, the stop, things of that nature, the break, the space, how do you deal with, you know, catching yourself in those moments where it's like, okay, I need to stop and think about this. And I'm going to resist the temptation to get going again until I've actually given it the thought that it needs.
Yeah, I have to say I'm less good at the long pause. So your example of like, I'll just take a few hours off or whatever, but I've gotten better and better at the short pause, which is just like in the moment, wait, that feels a little bit off. Let me like step back and think about this for a second, or just like noticing what's going on, or even just so like in a meeting, I have like a very excited energy. I like want to contribute. Oh my gosh, I get so excited about that thing. And just recently I've been like, that's good, whatever. It's fun. I hope it's helpful to other people, but also it's not really allowing me to do any thinking whatsoever. So just like not talking as much, just listening more, because there's another thing too, which is so there, like if we're talking about efficiency, there are a couple ways to get efficiency, right? One is to execute more quickly, right? So like, I know I'm going to teach a class. I've taught the class before. I want to get better at prepping that so that I have more time to relax, maybe more time to mingle with the students beforehand. I'm going to make that process of creating the class more efficient.
Right.
There's some distance, there's some efficiency that you can create there, but it kind of takes as long as it takes, and you can do it a little bit faster or a little bit slower. The other is like the efficiency of decision-making, right? And that can vary wildly. You can take 3 months to make a decision that you can make in a minute, literally.
Yep.
And so like, what's the criteria that you're making the decision on? And what I'm finding is like letting the decisions linger in the background, and then the decision kind of makes itself, So the like not being like, okay, I have an hour, we're going to go through all the data and we're going to decide. It's like, okay, let's take a half an hour, look at the data. Now let's go do something else. Now tonight, I'll kind of think about it. When I wake up in the morning, I might have a decision. I'll write that down, see how that feels for a day. Okay. And you have this like sort of background space that if you're not like urgently afraid, it's the fear versus kind of curiosity thing. If you're in the curiosity space of like, well, let's see where I land on this decision, you just have more background time to make a decision than you think. But if you're in the fear, I got to make it now, you're not even in actually a really good space to make it, because you're assuming that in this hour, I'm going to have the wisdom to make this decision correctly, versus saying like, well, when I have the wisdom, I will make the decision. You know? And I think we get very obsessed with the things that we can control, as if the things we control are the things that matter most. And they're not. Like luck and timing matter as much as, my ability to execute something. But I don't control those things. But can I put myself in a situation where I might like kind of run into them more? Or, I can control my ability to kind of take advantage of them. I might not be able to control when they happen.
Well, and I think the other thing is, really quickly before I get to you, Carissa, on this is, if you're coming from a place of fear, you're going to go right to judgment instead of curiosity. Like you're going to go, because the emotional stuff gets wrapped up in there. So then you become, then your decisions are clouded by that. Again, you can't think clearly, therefore you can't really judge. Whereas curiosity, you're coming in with an open mind, right? You're coming in with like, what does this look like? And I think it's just being willing to tell the world, you can wait. Like we experienced that for like a good period of time, not too long ago with the pandemic, and the world did not, implicitly blow up. Things slowed down. I'm feeling that there's this real desire to ramp them back up to the speed that they were before. But now you're seeing resistance from people who are like, wait a minute. Like there are some people like, hold up, maybe there was some merit to this, right? Like maybe we don't need to go back into the office 5 days a week, and when people are saying, well, no, you got to be in the office, I got to see you work. I'm like, well, that says more about you than it does about me. And also, is it really that you want us back in the office, or did you just invest a lot of money in this commercial real estate that's going to go the way of the dodo because of the fact that you don't have us here? Like, are your intentions pure? And once you fears there, that purity is kind of, diluted, if not eliminated. So Carissa, when it comes to you and the pause, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, when you first said the opt-out, my head jumped to the realm of privacy, right? Which is a very fascinating area that I think a ton about, right? Because our privacy with related to especially the digital world is one that we think we may have some control over, and we don't have much unless you do that total opt-out that you're talking about. However, the minute you opt out of participating in a certain app or whatever, you lose the utility, and there's like a cultural expectation that you're using it, and so then you're like, it's almost like you can't really opt out. And I think that is an incredibly tricky situation to be in. However, like if you love privacy too, like it's really important to look at the other side of that continuum. If privacy's on one side, what are things that could be on the other side? Well, one of them is mass surveillance, which is like all your data being collected and used by this tech company and this one and sold to the lowest bidder, right? Like highest bidder, right? I think like how our data is used is something to be extremely concerned about. However, like another end of that privacy continuum is things like herd immunity, right? The minute we all say like when you are sick or that you have been vaccinated or not, like we get a sense for how healthy our population is, what we can do about it.
Right.
So there are like some beautiful things that come with sharing our information and using that for positive. And then there's some really tricky things that also come with that. And the fact that it's on us as individuals to decide, like to me sometimes feels unfair, right?
You're swimming upstream. Yeah. I mean, it's really tricky. And the problem is that everything that's coming at us either says get out altogether or you're in, so you might as well go all in. Like there's no gray. It's either, and again, fear. It's so weird when you think about fear, because fear can keep you in those very binary ways of thinking, but it also gets into the gray as well, because the gray is like your fear is now of the unknown. It's not of it's the that's where it can really thrive. And this leads to my last question, which is been on my mind since I had another conversation with a guest about ecology and economy and and I don't know enough about this, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because you have obviously dedicated a lot of time and energy into a book about assembling tomorrow. And I can't help but think that a better tomorrow involves more of the meshing of ecology and economy together as opposed to them trying to live in separate lanes. And occasionally, like you pointed out, Scott, running into each other. It's almost like they need to be holding hands. And I'd love to hear, Chris, I'll start with you, and then Scott, I'll get to you. What are your thoughts on that? Am I way out in left field because I've been reading too much about this stuff? Am I on track? Is there, again, a gray area that I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, one thing that we do in this book is, it's a nonfiction book, but we have fictional stories throughout it, right? There's 20 speculative fiction stories, and they're all set slightly in the future from now, unless they've come true already, which is a whole other thread we could talk about. But the idea behind using that fiction, right, is to try on potential near futures and see if we like how we show up in them. It's a way of prototyping our imaginations. And one of those stories is one that's called a noble currency index. And what that is really if you think it says, I think it's from the year 2050, we say, but really within that, it talks about all of these different things that in that 2050 world, we have given value to that are different than the things that we necessarily currently value today. And some of those have to do with things that are, like invisible labor, like home care, sex workers, etc. But then other things have to do with things that are more intertwined with our environment and where preservation has happened, etc. And so I think by playing with that vector, it allows us to tee up that conversation that you're asking about, Mike.
What about you, Scott? And yeah, I love the idea of, again, it's such an interesting way we're in this really awkward phase, I think, right now in general, generationally. Like there's the older generation that is getting older and they're losing kind of their dominion over a lot of the roles in society that they had for the longest time. I'm a Gen Xer, so we never really, we kind of got skipped over because there weren't enough of us. And now it's our kids that are kind of inheriting the millennials and so on and so forth. And I feel like there's this weird, awkward tug of war where there probably doesn't need to be. It could be more of a let's go along to get along. But there's this tug of war happening, and that's where it comes to that discussion about economy and ecology for me. But Scott, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you're right on to be talking about that, and I love the link between those two. So the main thing, I think the main issue is that the ecology has to deal with the economy, and the economy chooses not to deal with ecology.
Yeah.
And there are some people who've been talking about this for a while. We talk about one person in the book named Herman Daly, and he described himself as an ecological economist. So he takes, all that into account, and that's definitely worth checking out. He coined this phrase that, we make goods and services. So those are our goods. And then we create all this ecological impact that's bad. Those are our bads. So he's like, we got to accept the bads along with our goods and services. And it's really nice and very clean. And then the other person who's doing amazing work, I think, around this is a British economist named Kate Raworth. And she has this idea of donut economics. And the basic idea is that we can do anything we need to do within two constraints. On one end, it's human thriving. Like we got to make sure that everybody can thrive. On the other hand, it's not, harming the planet. So but after that, if we're in between those things, we have a lot of room to play. And I feel like that's just impossible to argue with. Like who doesn't want to do that? But there's resistance to it, I think, because in the same way Carissa was talking about how individually we have to manage our data, it's sort of like each company is kind of managing their competition with everybody else. And they're worried that, if I have to take XYZ thing into account, that's going to be a competitive disadvantage. But I think that this gets back to Runaway Design, maybe to bring it full circle. We're just in this moment where all the things that we're doing are kind of pushing the limits of the things that we kind of felt were limitless. The environment and climate being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, though, I think we're pushing the limits of our imagination with like social media and political polarization. And so, we're seeing those limits come out in fits and starts, in hurricanes and arguments. And, we need to take them into account. Otherwise, we're just going to push them until they don't work anymore.
Scott, Carissa, this has been a great conversation. I do have one last question for you as I go through the book. One of the first things I noticed, and I know, Carissa, you're talking about that you can't see this, everyone, but there's a diagram from the book, like an image from the book that you have framed behind you, right, Carissa, if I remember correctly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This is
beautiful, beautiful stuff. But the first thing I noticed when I opened the book was a Papermate Flare pen. So my question, especially when it comes, I'm a fountain pen guy. And I love my nice notebook. So I'll start with you, Scott. What is your pen of choice? Is it this borrowed Papermate Flare, or do you have one that you carry with you and is your like kind of daily driver?
I do have two. One is the Bic Le Pen, so like these are like the pens that you had in, grade school.
Yeah.
And I have a friend who finds like just like really great ones. There's one that's like, oh yeah, those guys. Yeah.
Yep.
All these different colors. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Sorry. That's the other one. Sorry. I combined them. One is the Le Pen, which is that felt tip. I love that one. And the other is the Bic that you push.
The one that you could lock portables with, because they fit the
exactly.
Allen key. It matched the Allen key that you could lock the portable with to lock your teacher out of the classroom.
Yes. And I have a friend who finds like incredible color combinations. Like there are ones where the clicker is see-through, and there's other ones where they're all different neutral tones. And like, so I have those around too.
What about you, Carissa?
I do use a flare. I like a flare.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that I use, when I want to write slower, we're talking about speed, I use a brush pen. Because you have to slow down what you're writing. So often in my notebooks, I will like take a quote or something that I don't want to forget. I'm trying to find one that I feel okay putting on screen.
We won't be sharing the screen stuff, but yeah, no, I get it.
The screen doesn't get shared.
No,
right?
we're not going to share the video.
Like when there's like something that I want to take in and I want like to remember it.
Yeah,
I will write it with that brush pen, because what that allows me to do is like slow down and like internalize what that quote is that I'm writing.
Yeah.
And I'm just not going to hold one up because I've
that's fine. But like, there's a kinesthetic action though. You're right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I swear by this brand of notebook too, the Equa.
Oh yeah.
Like that size, and then like I try to alternate the colors.
Yep.
And make it so that like even though I've run through all the colors, they feel fresh each time. We all have our things.
And the reason I knew I could ask the both of you this, because you'd come up with interesting answers as to what again, Jerry Seinfeld, I think that's what he uses, is those old school Bics. He just buys boxes of them. Yeah. Whereas I'm like, I've got my Lamy 2000 that I wanted to have. And I bought it just before they got acquired by, I think it was Unilever or one of them that acquired it. So I wanted to get like one that I knew was made at the Lamy factory and things like that. But using tools you love and are comfortable with is part of like I think there's a joy that comes from that too.
I think you see it in both of us. We're like, oh yeah, now we can really start talking.
Well, we could, again, we only scratched the surface, and there's a lot of depth in this book. Assembling Tomorrow, a guide to designing a thriving future. Scott and Carissa, I'll start with you. Carissa, where can people keep up with the work that you're doing? And then Scott, where can people keep up with the work you're doing? And then, where can people pick up the book?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so you could find me there. And then I think you can also find both of us on the d.school.stanford.edu website.
Yep. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and I have to say, I don't update too much, which is sort of by design. I need to get the word out, but I also, like to stay away from the socials sometimes. But we also have, we've been publishing a bunch of books. So we have 12 books right now. And if you go to that d.school website, d.school.stanford.edu, /books. You can find all the books there.
Scott and Carissa, thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mike. Thanks.
All right, let me finish the recording here. Thanks to Scott and Carissa for joining me today. You can check out all of the links and show notes stuff at mikevardy.com/podcast591 or wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, even YouTube. While you are checking out those various platforms where you get your podcasts, subscribe to the show. That way you won't miss a single episode of what's to come, which includes our regular Flashback Friday episodes, our monthly series known as PM Talks, where myself and my good friend Patrick Rohn get together and just talk about topics related to productiveness and managing your relationship with time, and so much more. So becoming a subscriber is one way to support the show. Another way is to check out the sponsors you heard during today's conversation. Go to mikevardy.com/podcast sponsors, click on any of the sponsors that resonated with you, and that way they know that we sent you. That's it for this episode of A Productive Conversation. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.